Becoming a Real Man of God by Father Roger J. Landry. Becoming a Real Man of God. Introduction. When David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies. Showing oneself a strong, faithful man of God. Over the past several decades, for many reasons, men have been suffering an identity crisis. Whereas in former days, a son would clearly have grasped his father's instructions, show yourself a man. Today's such instruction might not be so readily understood. The messages are culture broadcast about men where men are consistent and confusing. In movies and on television, the images of men are very widely, from violent take no prisoners, pseudo-superheroes to smooth-talking machismo-driven womanizers to sheepish and vulnerable woman heroes who seem to want to be one of the girls more than one of the guys. Professional sports figures often leave men and boys empty of genuine role models as well. Rare is the positive image of ordinary, hardworking men who are faithful to God, to the church, to their wives, and to their families and friends. Within the church as well, it is not as easy as one was for men and boys to find living examples of what it means to be a man of God. Priestly vocations are down, and so, therefore, is the number of priests with whom other men can identify. Except for the Knights of Columbus, male-orientated groups like the Holy Name Society, once a staple of every parish, have all but disappeared. Many charitable and liturgical activities are now so dominated by women, even those like the St. Vincent de Paul Society and altar-serving corps, which once were monopolized by men, that many men have begun to feel out of place, as if religion and service of God in the church are mainly female enterprises. As the disproportion of women to men at Mass has grown, so has men uneasiness. Within this context, it is urgent to return to the question of what it means to be a man from God's perspective and explore his vocation in the church and in the world. Does man's God-given mission differ from woman's, and if so, how? Are there any role models men can turn to in order to learn how to become the men their Father in heaven calls them to be? How can men today arm and defend themselves against the cultural phenomena that are weakening their identity and diverting them from their God-given tasks? Back to the beginning. To discuss the question of what it means to be a man, we need to return to the origin of the human person. We learn from the beginning of the book of Genesis that God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Genesis 1:27. We find here two central and related truths. First, the human person is created in God's image, to see ourselves as we really are. Therefore, we need first to look to God in whom we reflect. St. John, inspired by God, and writing his beautiful first letter, tell us that God is love, John 4:16, which teaches us quite a bit about God. In fact, many teachers of the Catholic faith have seen in those three words an indication of three persons of the Blessed Trinity. As we know from the human experience of love, there's always one who loves, one who is loved, and the bond of love that unites them. For God to be love, he could not have been unitary or all alone. Before the creation of the world, he needed rather to be this threefold reality of love existing in the unity, an eternal lover, beloved, and love between them, all at the same time. Some of the great saints throughout the centuries have in their teachings about the Blessed Trinity attempted to name the persons of the Trinity on the basis of the reality of love, saying God the Father is most like the eternal lover, God the Son is the eternal beloved, and God the Holy Spirit is the love between them so strong that it assumes its own personality. The Blessed Trinity is an eternal communion of love, or better, a loving communion of persons. Since man was created in God's image, we would expect man to exist in the living communion of persons. This is the second truth we see in the passage from the book of Genesis. God created man who just as him, but as them, and not as just as them. Of two or more hymns, but in a very specific way. Male and female created them. God created the human person, male and female, to reflect his love. and made it possible for a man and woman to live in a loving communion of persons so strong their love itself could take on a personality. That's precisely what happens in the loving communion of persons we call marriage, in which, by God's design, man and woman can make love by literally becoming one flesh in their offspring, a child. The son or daughter is a fruit of the love, and by the child's participation in their communion, a means by which that love can continue to grow and flourish. So it is not some biological accident that there are men and women. There is original differentiations as part of God's plan from the beginning. God made man and woman equal in dignity and similar in so many respects, but also different and complementary in so many other respects. At the level of the sexual organs, their minds and personalities, and even in their cells, chromosomes, hormones, and so much more. These differences in particular are caught up mysteriously in the image of God. These complementary divergences, so to speak, are meant to be caused to communion, to elicit the recognition on the part of both that they need the other in order to become all what it means to be human. These differences urge them on inwardly to give off themselves with love, to remedy what other lacks, and to welcome and receive from the other what they are incapable of being or doing on their own. Phrased in another way, the original and complementary differences of man and woman were to help each learn how to love. We see this truth inspired literally from the book of Genesis. After God had accomplished the first 5 phases of creation and pronounced them good, and after he had created man, he now pronounced things very good. Adam had named all creation and lived in harmony with it. It was before original sin and he was living on good terms with God. But then God said something was not quite right. It is not good that man should be alone. So God created Eve from Adam. Eve was meant to be a fitting helper for Adam, one who would help him become fully human. Adam's original solitude helped him to recognize both that he was different from all the rest of creation and from God, and that he needed another to help him to experience the fullness and joy of human life. When Eve was created and Adam beheld her, that's what happened. Adam cried out with joy. Genesis 2:18-23. This recognition of the need for the other was what led to their quest of a loving unity, which would help them become who God created them to be, and open them up to live in a communion of love with Him. Eve's vocation was to help Adam overcome his original solitude and loneliness and teach him how to love. She would help him to learn how to love another, and through the analogy of human love, she would help him learn how to love himself and how to receive and reciprocate God's love. Adam's vocation was to help Eve to learn to do the same. Woman has a crucial role in a man's vocation and vice versa. Real love. The original difference between man and woman, from the first man and woman to every man and woman, is meant to help us learn how to love. But that obviously raises the question of what true love is. Love is not merely a warm feeling of attraction or admiration for another person. Jesus Christ told us during the Last Supper what true love is, and then put the message into the body language in the following afternoon on the cross. Greater love has no man than this, he said, that a man laid down his life for his friends. John 15:13. Love is not merely wishing another the best, but a willingness to choose to give off oneself, even to the point of sacrificing one's own interests, desires, and life for someone else's. This is the type of love that will lead to genuine fulfillment and happiness, because this is the type of love that will help us become the real image of God. Each of us is called to give himself unselfishly to others just as Christ did. Jesus himself called us to this love twice during the Last Supper when he said, "Love one another as I loved you." The first apostles learned to live by these words and called their fellow Christians to the same self-giving. St. John said clearly that love is not words but deeds. By this we know love, that Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and in truth. This laying down of one's life does not mean only the willingness to make the supreme sacrifice for another, but the willingness to die to oneself so that other may more fully live. In marriage preparation, I often ask would-be grooms whether they love their fiancée enough to take a bullet for her. Never has one said no. Then I ask whether his answer would be the same if the bullet took one of the following forms: being abstinent, before marriage, giving up smoking if she asks, being on time if he's habitually late, cleaning up after himself better, patiently telling her what happened that day of work if she requested, learning the faith better to help pass it on to her more completely, or making the time and priority to pray with her. Those are the types of grenades on which many men refuse to dive. But these gifts of oneself are so much more valuable than almost material gift one could give, and they are far greater sign of real love than any ring can symbolize. When a future husband and wife begin to love each other through sacrifices like this, their marriage can become what it's meant to be, a sacrament, invisible sign and reflection of Christ's love for his bride, the church, because Christ who loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her. Men and women love differently. The ultimate vocation of man is the same as the calling of a woman, to love as Christ loves, which means to give off oneself unselfishly to and for others. This type of life will allow one to be a true image of God and to grow into God's holy likeness. Our focus on Genesis also showed us that part of this loving of others involves loving receiving the other's gifts of self. The mutual giving and receiving of self gifts is what brings about the communion of persons. But while man and woman are both called to give off themselves to the other and to welcome the other's gifts of self, how each does so varies. Many students of Pope John Paul II theology of the body have developed this insight that there is a profound complementary in the way man and woman love. The Patriarch of Venice, Cardinal Angelo Scola, has phrased it in this way: men receive love by giving love, women give love by receiving love. This is true on several levels. At the level of physiology, it's obvious in the design of the human act of making love. A woman has been made by God to receive love, and she gives off her love to her husband principally by receiving within her own body the bodily gift of her husband. Man experiences the real welcome of the love of his wife when he is embraced and giving off himself in this way. We see the same complementarity too at the level of psychology. One of the fastest ways for a woman to frustrate a man is to not allow or appreciate a sacrificing himself for her. Men, for example, want to pick up the tab on a date because they show their affection for a woman by saying she is worth the effort at work to make the money to take her out. One of the quickest ways for a man to frustrate a woman, on the other hand, is to not allow her to receive him into her life. When a wife, for instance, asks her husband to describe for her what his day was like and he refuses, it wounds her deeply because she wishes to receive him and his experiences into her life. We see this complementary illustrated unmistakably in the familiar tradition of the marriage proposal and the engagement ring. Man gives the proposal. He offers himself, his heart, his vulnerability, his future to the woman, and the woman accepts or rejects the proposal. He generally proposes with ring, which is a very costly sign of his fidelity and love. If she accepts the proposal, she accepts the ring. In receiving the ring, she gives the man one of the greatest joys of his life. The woman does not give the man in return, for example, a watch, because it would be pointless. The very fact that she has accepted the man's proposal and received the symbol of commitment and love and placed it on her finger is enough of sign of love for him in return.